It's 2 p.m. now. So, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to cool Delhi. And we are very happy to see all your smiling faces from all around the world, from all around India. And namaskar, swagatam. India Land and Development Conference is really proud with his partners, with his associates, to have all of you here. And we are looking forward to a 3 days of exciting interactions, inclusive interactions, changing conversations around land rights. And we are very happy that all of you could find time to come together and make this a reality. Now I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Dr. Tajamul Haq, who is I think we should give a big hand to him. And he is the real force behind all this. He is the chairman of this India Land and Development Conference. And I'm also inviting Tim Hanstad. Give a big hand from him. He arrived late, I think early morning at 3 o'clock, and up there to deliver the keynote address. Thank you, Tim. See, as all of us you know, and I need not dare to elaborate, how complex is land governance and land rights and land issues. And together maybe more than 10,000 years of experience would be here working around land issues. But that underlines one thing, that addressing land issues, land governance, land rights is not possible alone. We need to have long-term partnership, committed partnership, and try to address the land issues. And we are very happy that the journey begun last year is getting more and more traction with new partners joining, and we are co-traveling in this journey together. We started with the humble initiative last year where 10 organizing committee member, about 6 knowledge partners came in, 1 media partner, and we had about 150 participants coming from 15 states and also 4 countries. But today, I will not dare to disclose how many participants are different countries, and because that will be talking the last day. But I am very proud to say that today we have 10 organizing committee members continuing committedly, and we have 18 knowledge partners and session organizers. So that is a huge, huge thing, and we must celebrate this partnership, and all of them are here. You can see, and some of them are not here because you will be seeing them in different sessions. And some of them they are also in another initiative called State of Land Report. So together they have 18 institutions, international and national. They have come together, academia institutions, civil society institutions, private sector, innovators, all of them come together to celebrate this partnership, what we call India Land and Development Conference. So I must thank all of them, and we really look forward to a very enriching and learning journey with all of you. This conference has 4 themes, as you would have noted. It starts with connection, talk about inclusion and decentralization, go to technology, and last but not the least, focus on capacity building. Just all of you would have read it, just to connect briefly to that. In connection, by means it is not only connecting Indian stakeholders with each other, connecting Indian states with each other, because land is a state subject in India. Different lands have different experiences which we will be listening to over coming years. It is also about connecting local and global discourses around land. Because as we know that when you talk about land, and with SDG coming in, NDC coming in, VGT coming in, there are a lot of issues which we need to connect from what we are doing. A simple example is when you talk about women land right, the issue raised by Makam around women farmers also need to be brought into the international agenda. So I think in that context it's very important how our partners who are working with different places around different land issues, be it commons, be it women land right, be it land and investment, be it land data, urban governance, they bring in their perspective and we connect that to the global discourses. And one of the brightest thing I would say, and the highlight of the Indian Land Development Conference is that each of the session is hosted by one partner institutions. So it is not like somebody imposing, somebody inviting only researchers to come together. You have practitioners, you have government officials, you have innovators, you have journalists that are coming together, and there is ownership the way 15 sessions and 4 master classes being organized. As you can see the agenda, you find different institutions that are coming together, and this is going to be I think, a greatest melting pot, because on land there are already few institutions working in India, and when they try to come together, I think it is going to generate a lots of traction, and we are going to have a better influence and better action the way land governance will shape up in the future. Before inviting team, I would like to have just a couple of words for Dr. Huck and team as well, because with the round of applause coming in, I could invite Dr. Huck properly, neither team properly. So let me take the honor of inviting them once again. If you talk about land in India, the name which comes first is, I think, Dr. Tajamul Huck, because of his work around land leasing, his work around tenancy, and of late chairing the land policy cell of Niti Aayog, not only on this land leasing but also on conclusive titling. So, and the best thing about him is such an amicable person and such a down-to-earth person, never making any aura about himself, and always there to help others. And I think whoever is working in land in India, there some or other time have been associated with him and learn from him. Thank you, sir, for being the chair and inspiring all of us. So it is not a vote of thanks now, but I think I must start with that note, because you have been the inspiration in taking us forward. And we are very happy having team with us who is not an international expert on land, but also an Indian expert on land, having worked a lot in India, and the person who has really influenced many policies in India around women land rights, and also contributed significantly to the land leasing policy. And we felt team, none of any other person can be the best person to really give the keynote address, having known India so closely and having worked globally so efficiently and effectively. So I have the pleasure to ask Dr. Huck to chair the session and then invite team to give the keynote address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, friends. I think, again, on behalf of this India Land Conference, I welcome all of you. At this point, I don't say anything. Maybe I formally request Mr. Tim to give his keynote address. That is how we start. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be here and to be able to make this address. I want to thank and acknowledge the Center for Land Governance, NRMC, for your role in putting this together, in convening such a group of experts, this growing network of organizations and people working on land rights in India. It is indeed a thrill to be part of this. And again, as Pranab pointed out, we are all indebted to Dr. Hawk for his leadership in this field. And it was my great fortune very early on in my work in India to be able to meet with Dr. Hawk and to see a kindred spirit in many ways. And so thank you, Dr. Hawk, for all your many contributions to India, to this field of land rights, and to me and my family as well. A personal note of thanks. And thank you also to the other groups who are organizers. Oh, I'm afraid looking at this slide, to me, I look at it with just a sense of gratitude of how many organizations and quality organizations are out there working on on different aspects of these issues in India, and particularly the groups that are here based in India. I mean, the Indian groups, that really is encouraging. But it's also encouraging to see so many prominent international, global groups working on land rights that are here. And I know we'll get a chance to hear from many of those throughout the next 2.5 days. So I've been working on issues of land rights for more than 31 years now in more than 22 countries. But no country has captured my attention, my focus, and my heart than India. And I don't say that because I'm in India and in front of you. I say it because it's true. I have a deep, deep affinity for India. In the years living and working here, I have learned so much about, not only about India, but the more I learn about India, the more I realize I don't know about India. So I'll be a lifelong student of India. But learning from farmers, learning from leaders like Dr. Hawk, learning from my colleagues at Landesa, some of whom are here in the audience, and I haven't gotten a chance to say hello to many of you, so hello. Learning from our partners. It's just been such a fantastic journey. And some of you know that I'm also married to a South Indian, Chitra. So that's also part of my affinity for India. And Chitra and I have 4 wonderful children whose Indian names and looks make them identify as Indians and not as a European American like their father. Fortunately, they look much more like their mother than me. And in fact, when long ago, when my youngest daughter was very, very young and I was living and working in India, she came up to me and looked at me and said, "Dad, how did you get to become part of our family when you're not Indian?" And so that's always struck me. When I like to think of myself at least as part Indian, and I hope you will excuse me for so thinking. The topic of our time together over the next 2.5 days is land policy, land rights, land governance. And as I get older, I sometimes reflect on what is it about this topic that has drawn me in so closely. And I think a big part of it is the power and the opportunity in land rights that so often help define the trajectory of a person, of a family, of a community, and a country. It's about story, and our friends from Thomson Reuters here and other journalists have recognized that there's so much story in land. And my own life and family history provides an example. See, I'm the grandson of Norwegian immigrants to North America. My mother's father grew up a poor, uneducated, orphan farm laborer in Norway. His dream as a child, and he kept a diary, so I've had the privilege of being able to follow his life. His dreams as a young man were to save money, enough money to lease in land to farm, and eventually, hopefully, to get to be in a place where he could buy his own farm. And after chasing that dream for a while as a young man in post-World War I Norway, he realized it may take him decades to achieve it, and he may not ever achieve it. So he pursued another livelihood option. He sailed across the ocean for a better paying work in America. And he found work there in a logging camp as a laborer, where he worked his entire career. He earned enough after a few years to send for my grandmother in Norway to join him. He never did become a landowner. His entire life, he lived a very difficult life of manual labor, raising 5 children, with whom he emphasized the importance of a good education and of land ownership as key issues in helping provide a solid economic foundation. Now, my father's parents were also Norwegian immigrants to the U.S. They came to America with some small savings, enough to purchase a small plot of land, which they cleared and started farming. They grew some subsistence crops. They grew strawberries and had some cattle, which the strawberries and cattle they marketed. And owning land put them on a much more solid economic foundation. When my paternal grandfather died suddenly in his early 50s, my grandmother inherited that land and was able to support herself into old age, first by managing the farm and later with the money she earned from selling the farm. Now, as a young boy, I grew up in this rural agricultural community, and I spent my summers working on local farms. And it was there, as a boy of about 10 years old, I encountered other laborers who were working very diligently along with their entire families. They were migrant laborers from Mexico. And in befriending one of the Mexican boys who was about my age, I learned that they too had come to America because they didn't have land. And they lacked land and they lacked opportunity in Mexico and came to America hoping to earn enough money to buy a house, buy a land, and a farm in the U.S. So I came to understand the importance of land rights and land ownership at an early age. And I could see from my own family history and the experience of so many families in my community that owning land could make a transformative difference in the trajectory of a person, the trajectory of a family. And it was not the only way in my agrarian community to advance in life, but having land of one's own certainly increased opportunities. And I imagine that I tell you the story in part to tell you a little bit about myself, but to also to encourage you to reflect on your own family, personal and family history, because I suspect that most of you can look at that history and point to how owning land or not owning land, about how buying land or losing land made a transformative difference in your own family history. So it's clear that issues of land rights determine trajectories of family histories. They also determine trajectories of countries. When I went to school, I studied history and political science, later studied law. In studying history, I became fascinated with how different countries approached the land question, how to allocate and how to define rights to land. I learned about how so many wars, so many civil conflicts were fought over issues of land conflicts, land justice, land disputes. So many of the revolutions of the 20th century, the century in which I've spent most of my life, were fought over perceived inequities of land. And in looking at these issues more closely, I found that decisions around land policy often change the social and economic trajectories of countries and of regions. In fact, I think it's not outlandish to say that land policy's decisions that result in both secure rights to land and resulting in the broad-based kind of more equitable distribution of land are ones that are likely to lead to long-term peace and prosperity for countries. Cross-country regressions actually illustrate that secure property rights have a significant positive impact on country-wide economic growth. Cross-country regressions also show that a more egalitarian distribution of land and other assets tends to be characterized by higher rates of economic growth. So providing secure and broad-based land rights makes transformative differences at the macro level and at the micro level. And we have a growing body of literature that illustrates this, particularly at the micro level. A body of literature that shows that when it's particularly focused on poor people and communities, when poor people and communities have secure land rights, good things happen. Studies demonstrate that when people gain secure legal rights to land, they are much more willing to make productivity-enhancing investments in the land, which increases income, which increase yields, which increases wealth. In many settings, obtaining legally documented rights to land provides access to credit, but not only credit, provides access to government services, to crop insurance, input subsidies, tuition waivers, urban infrastructure. Studies show that secure land rights increases returns to labor, it reduces conflict and crime, it increases environmentally friendly practices, and it's not enough, it's never enough to focus on the household as a unit when looking at these micro-level issues. Who within the household shares in those land rights is fundamentally important. And the evidence shows that when women share in rights to land, even more good things happen. Income and farm productivity increase even more. Larger portions of the family income are directed to children's education and nutrition. Domestic violence decreases. So land policy and land governance matter, certainly for the most marginalized, but for everyone. For poor, for rich, for rural, for urban. And in India, we can see this is certainly true. Land has been and continues to be of enormous relevance, economically for sure, but not just economically. We can't look at land just as an economic asset. It remains of fundamental importance socially, culturally, politically, symbolically, spiritually. The way in which access to land can be obtained and rights in land documented are at the core of the livelihood of a large majority of the poor, especially in rural and especially in tribal areas, especially also in urban areas. Land policies and administration are critical determinants for governance, for the costs and modalities of accessing land for residential use, for business use, for the development of the financial sector. Land also continues to be a source of government revenue and a key component for implementing government programs. I mentioned in a session earlier this morning that a McKinsey study from a few years back that was looking at what are the impediments to growth for the Indian economy identified insecure land rights, dysfunctional landmarks as one of three most important impediments. And they calculated that this was robbing the country of 1.3 percentage points of economic growth per year. That's an enormously costly impediment to growth here in India. So in sum, the issues being raised by this important conference are critical for India. They're central to many of India's and the planet's most important challenges, addressing poverty, sustainable and inclusive growth, good governance. And one benefit of getting old, and there are benefits, and of working on this same topic across much time and space, is that one starts to notice trends across countries and across the globe. And generally speaking, I'm very pleased to observe that the relative importance of land issues on development agendas is emerging. And it's been particularly emerging in the last 10 years. And this is true across the globe. It's also true in India. Globally, one might look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. You know, the earlier goals, the Millennium Development Goals that were developed some 20-odd years ago, if you look at those goals, you won't find land rights. In the more recently developed SDGs, land rights are explicitly integrated into targets under three goals. Goals for poverty, goals for food security, and goals for gender equality. And we're going to come back to those SDGs later, but I just want to note that this change from the MDGs to the SDGs itself and the role of land rights within those goals is reflective of the emergence of land rights issues on the global development agenda. And we also see this emergence here in India. In fact, this conference, the fact that we're all here together, is itself reflective. In India, no small part to stalwarts such as Dr. Hawk and many others in government, to people in academia, in the research community, to a large number of groups in civil society, some old, some new, Ekta Parashad, FES, Housing and Land Rights Network, Center for Land Governments, IAHS, Landesa, and there are many more. It's always dangerous to start listing because I'll certainly miss them, many. But this group and growing group of civil society groups, of researchers, of government officials who are increasingly becoming focused on different aspects of the land rights here in India is reflective of its emergence. And there appears to be a growing consensus among policymakers that land governance and land administration, which admittedly, I think, here in India fell into neglect particularly as revenue officers had to attend to a myriad of other duties. These issues are in urgent need of improvement to address the development challenges of the 21st century. So the key question is not whether, but how to go about this task most effectively, and which land policy topics need to be addressed and prioritized to ensure that doing so will have the greatest impact on reducing poverty and promoting inclusive growth. So, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to briefly list and introduce and comment on, briefly, 8 related topics that I believe need to be prioritized and urgently addressed, not only by government at both the national and the state levels, but by civil society, by academia, by research institutions. These 8 overlapping topics are ones that I hope and expect we will delve into much more deeply during this important conference. So topic 1, land for the absolute landless. India has by far the largest number of landless households on the planet. And landlessness is closely associated with poverty. In fact, analysis has shown that landlessness is the best predictor of poverty in India. It's a better predictor of poverty than illiteracy, and it's a better predictor of poverty than membership in a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Given that, just given that, efforts to reduce poverty have to include efforts at providing land for the landless. And the good news is this can be accomplished. We have experience here within India and beyond that point to some kind of growing good practices of how this can be done. And it can be done through a variety of different. It's just not one way to do it. We don't have to rely just on what had been the primary tool, that is, of sealing surplus land legislation. There are other ways of accomplishing it. And I would say just one aspect of what I think is best practice from the experience internationally and from here in India. It suggests that for the absolutely landless, that house site land is relatively more important than other land. Even in rural areas, it's more important than agricultural land. And it's desired more by those absolutely poor households. So if you can only do one, that's not to say that you shouldn't be focusing on providing other types of land, but if you can only do one, if you can only focus on one first, focus on house sites, and preferably in rural areas in particular, house sites that are large enough to grow a large garden, to keep some animals, and to conduct some livelihood activities. Topic 2, regularizing informal occupation. This is a huge topic. There are tens of millions of poor rural and urban households in India who are long-term occupants and users of land that is, in most cases, claimed to be owned by the government, sometimes on private land. But those people don't have formal legal rights to that land. So this includes land used for residential purposes, for agricultural cultivation, for forest use, for other community purposes. State governments especially, and with the collaborative assistance of of civil society need to more urgently focus on providing secure, formalized legal rights to such poor long-term occupants. This notably includes more robust implementation of the Forest Rights Act, both for collective rights and for individual rights, but it also includes revenue land. Most states have progressive legislative provisions that allow for formalizing rights for poor long-term occupants, and those have been underused. I just encourage you, those of you who are out there in the NGO community, to become familiar with those effective progressive legislations and put them to use. Because NGOs can help by identifying those poor households that meet the eligibility requirements, by helping them with the acquired paperwork that's often needed, the application to the government, and even in assisting the government in processing. I know many of my Landesa colleagues out here have deep experience in that work. And just to give you one example of the opportunities in Karnataka, for example, we have a team there that's working on the issues of regularizing poor long-term occupants of Bagar Hukum land. And it's estimated that I think at least 1 million households could benefit. That is, households that are using land now in Karnataka under this category but don't have formalized rights. And giving communities more formal rights and governance over their community property resources is another important issue under this topic. I know our friends at FES and many others are at the forefront of this work, working with communities across several states to help improve their rights and effective governance of community property resources. Resources which should not be neglected, resources which poor households rely on much more than non-poor households. And informal occupation is not isolated to rural issues. In an urbanizing India, where due to colonial legacies, urban land records are sorely lacking, urban land tenure insecurity is an extremely important issue. Many urban residents are long-term occupants, settlers, lacking legal documentation for their residences. And I know the Prindex report that came out recently we'll be hearing more about, and it's also featured in the State of Land India report, which we're going to be launching later today, a plug for that, clearly illustrates some of these issues. Formalizing and strengthening the rights of urban informal settlers is a critical step to building a middle class in India. You know, in most high-income countries, if you look at middle-class people and look at their asset portfolio, housing is the primary part of that housing, of that asset portfolio, and that wealth portfolio. Thank you, Pranav. It's difficult. It will be difficult to achieve that in India without providing secure rights and documented rights to the households. So, topic 3, related, improving land records. So, although the situation certainly varies by state, the state of land records in India is generally inadequate, both textual records and spatial records. And the poor state of textual and spatial land records has a variety of negative impacts. It's a significant source of land tenure insecurity, certainly for the poor, but as I said, also much more broadly. Inadequate land records facilitate corruption, contribute to the high and costly incidence of land disputes. It reduces the government's ability to conduct effective planning, to effectively raise revenue, and it generally limits the capacity for good land governance. I think there's an urgent need to learn, and I hope this, and I expect this conference will contribute to it, to learn from the recent experience within India and beyond in order to develop viable and replicable models for improving and maintaining both textual and spatial records. This itself is a big topic, and I know we'll delve into it. I'll make just a few brief points here. First, the process of computerizing textual records in various states has pointed to, I think, several best practices, including the concurrent abolition of manual records, the ability to use the income generated to sustain and improve the system, and the importance of making the process transparent and the results broadly accessible. There's a particularly important best practice that I think has not been sufficiently implemented, and that's about using community-led, multi-sourced inventory processes to correct the mistakes in the manual records before those manual records are computerized. I mention that because without doing this, it's possible, in fact, even probable, that more marginalized community members will lose out in the process of land records modernization at the expense of elites. That is, land records modernization has a lot of potential for benefit, but there also is potential for harm if it's not done well. And if this step is not taken, that harm will almost certainly happen. I cannot overemphasize this point. Landes's team in Telangana conducted a 6-village pilot that involved a community-led process to identify the gaps between the existing records and what was understood as at least socially legitimate rights at the ground level. And the pilot found that the vast majority of households, and virtually all poor households, had problems. That is, there were gaps between what was in the land records and what was socially understood and legitimate at the ground level. So a cursory or a desk review of those land records would not have found these gaps, would not have uncovered the problems. And with the community-led inventory, the Revenue Department was able to strengthen the land rights. You identify the problems, you strengthen them in the purpose of or correct them in the process of modernizing them. And in doing so, you can formalize, strengthen the land rights of these marginalized households. A second point here concerning spatial data. It would seem most desirable to focus public sector activity here first on a comprehensive coverage with at least a low precision cadastral index map, rather than establishing islands of high-quality spatial data in an ocean that remains largely uncharted. I know we'll get into that issue later over the next 2.5 days. And finally, under this topic, a word on whether modernizing the current state of land records should be aiming to create a system of title registration. Title registration is not a silver bullet. And trying to create a short road to title registration can create more problems than it solves. So just enter it with your eyes wide open. It can create problems, particularly for the rural residents of the poor. It's my view that Indian states are likely to be better off pursuing a more immediate goal of updating the existing databases with the help of these community-led processes, functionally integrating the different databases used in land administration, and then providing land right holders with a certificate that combines relevant and current information pertaining to a plot. If this can be accomplished, along with the option of maintaining spatial data at a low cost and regulations to ensure that changes to textual and spatial data get updated in the system, as well as requiring just at least some of the registry officials to perform some basic validity checks, a deeds registration can offer 90% of the benefits of title registration at a fraction of the cost. And if you can achieve that first, you always then have the option of moving even further to title registration. So don't let the perceived best become the enemy of the good when you are in the debate of title registration versus deeds registration. Topic 4, farmland rentals or leasing. Here, farmland rental markets are a powerful, powerful tool in India and elsewhere for both increasing land access to landless and land-poor households and for more efficient use of land. Unfortunately, in India, the highly restrictive farmland rental restrictions in most Indian states have had a demonstrably negative impact on both poor households' access to land, on the tenure, security, insecurity of most tenants because they're informal, and on overall agricultural efficiency. Here, the Niti Aayog's Model Land Leasing Act provides a useful framework, useful guidance on how state-level laws with excessive rental restrictions can be changed. And it has been very encouraging, and I know Dr. Hawk will agree, to see that a handful of states have recently made legislative changes in this direction. But further policy reforms are needed in additional states. And making these changes will, as I said, will broaden land access for the poor, can help make tenants more productive by giving them more tenure security, access to government services and to credit, can put more land into productive use, because we do see that landowners often don't use or underutilize land because they're afraid to rent it out, and will also facilitate needed occupational mobility from agriculture. Topic 5, simplifying and harmonizing land legislation. So, good land-related legislation is clear, is consistent, and is relatively simple. I'm telling you that as a lawyer and as someone who's looked at the land legislation at many countries around the world. So the land legislation in most Indian states is anything but that. It's not to say there isn't good legislation out there is. But most states with which I'm familiar have dozens, if not scores, of land-related laws, some of them going back 2 centuries, with many provisions that are outdated, irrelevant, overly complicated, and inconsistent. Now, at least a couple of states have undertaken processes to review that legislation, to remove outdated, irrelevant provisions or even entire laws, to simplify it and to harmonize it into a single, much more clear and simple land revenue code. UP is at the forefront of this. More states could benefit from this process. Law is always better when it is clear, when it can be understood by those who are charged with implementing it, and understood by those for whom it is meant to apply. Topic 6, increasing land-related legal awareness and services. Now, whatever the state of land legislation, it is more effective when those who are governed by the law are familiar with its inherent rights and responsibilities. And Landesa has found in our work in India and elsewhere that poor households, and particularly women, generally have very low awareness of their land-related legal rights and how those might be asserted and exercised. Enhancing knowledge in this respect is an important step to enhancing power, and it's much needed. Also, particularly given the high incidence of land disputes in India and of how land litigation is clogging the courts. Again, another topic that will be covered in this report to be released here. Access to legal services for the poor is a big issue. NGOs, law colleges and university, legal service agencies all have a role to play in helping poor individuals, families, and communities exercise their rights to land. And the use of paralegals in particular is key here, because lawyers by themselves, and I say this as a lawyer, won't be able to solve the problem. India needs more paralegals working on issues of land to help poor people resolve their land problems. And this could have enormous potential in India for large-scale impact. Topic 7, closing land data gaps. Many of those working in the land sector across the world recognize that we face a shortage of land data. And I'll point here to 2 different categories of data, both of which require attention, both globally and in India. The first land data gap category is I'll call impact evidence data. We need more research attention on what land-related interventions work and which ones are not working. So we've learned a lot from past research. We continue to learn from current research, but there's so much more here to learn. If you are a researcher, this is a field ripe for contributions. If you're a funder, think about contributing to the further research and learning that's still needed. And I'm not talking about learning for the sake of learning. I'm talking about learning for the sake of advancing positive social and economic impact. The second data gap category I'll call foundational data. This is sex disaggregated data about who has land rights and the nature of those land rights. Unfortunately, governments around the world are not routinely and systematically collecting this data, including here in India. And on this foundational data, we have a potential solution embedded in those Sustainable Development Goals to which I referred to earlier, to which India, along with the larger community of nations, has signed on to. I noted earlier that land rights are integrated into the targets of 3 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 1, poverty. Goal 2, food security. Goal 5, gender equality. These land right targets, however, will be largely meaningless unless the related SDG indicators gain traction, gain prominence, such that governments, including the government of India, start systematically collecting data on land rights. So there's still work to be done to elevate the indicators. And I know Landesa and many others are doing that advocacy work. That advocacy work is needed here in India too, to advocate, to collect that data. Now, we don't have to rely just on governments here. The example of Prindex, again, I want to point out Prindex here, shows that related and comprehensive data can be systematically gathered through non-government means, and these means are really important. Again, you all have, I think, in your folder the Prindex report, which I hope you will look at, and I know that we'll be focusing on later in the program. And I also want to give a shout out here to the Land Portal Foundation for its important role as an information source for all things land data. Topic 8, last, but definitely not least, strengthening women's land rights. In fact, this is arguably the most important land-related topic for India. It's a cross-thematic topic that goes across all the previous 7 and more. Patriarchy is strong across the world. It's particularly strong here in India, where it limits economic and social progress. Levels of women's land ownership, land rights in India are particularly low. Levels of women's tenure security are high. Most women are dependent on men in their lives to access land, to productively use that land. The growing research we have indicates this is an enormous problem, not only for women, but for men, for children, for the broader society. And, if I can please, as a man, speak to men, We as men particularly cannot buy in to the falsehood that empowering women disempowers men. That's a lie. We empower not only daughters, wives, sisters, mothers when we empower women. We strengthen the broader community, nation, and world. Gender equality, women's economic empowerment is not a women's issue. It's a societal issue. And so much needs to be done here in India and across the world to strengthen women's land rights. And I certainly hope and expect that this topic will be a major theme of presentations and discussions here. So in closing, I've been speaking for a long time. Thank you for staying awake. I'm glad I was able to stay awake too. In closing, allow me to review the list of these 8 priority and overlapping challenges that I believe need more focused attention from government, from civil society, from researchers, from donors here in India. 1, providing land to the landless. 2, regularizing informal occupation in both urban and rural areas. 3, improving land records. 4, reducing farmland rental restrictions. 5, simplifying and harmonizing state-level land legislation. 6, increasing land-related legal awareness and services. 7, closing land data gaps. And 8, strengthening women's land rights. So given the quantity and the quality of attendees here at this conference, I'm hopeful that we can all come away from this conference with additional learnings, with additional inspiration, with additional connections to make progress on each of these 8 challenges. The poor, women, men, and communities here in India, in particular, deserve that. Thank you.
Thank you, team, for your excellent keynote address. I'm sure this must have been very encouraging to all of us listening to you. I don't know whether there is any question or clarification from the audience. If there are, I think maybe 2, 3, not many. Okay, please.
Mic वगैरह है नहीं?
Sanjay, it's louder.
Yeah, he's getting the mic for you.
Thank you. Let me first compliment a beautiful presentation, and this will go very helpful for anyone dealing with the land development and laws. I just want to ask one simple question, that land laws in parts of northeastern region of India, particularly in the interiors of Meghalaya, are very different than rest of the country. And as we know that that part of the country is very rich as far as natural resources are concerned. Though the natural resources are the property of the nation, but they cannot be explored over there. And do you suggest that government should do in this way, or the laws should be amended as far as that northeastern region is concerned?
Well, actually, Pranab should be answering this question. He's much more familiar with the northeastern states than I am, where I haven't done work. But so I should hand it over to him. But if I understood your question, do the laws need amending in these states, or is it the government? I didn't understand what the "or" part of that was.
The land laws in the interiors of Meghalaya are very, very different, and though they are in favor of the locals, But the thing is, if you want to do something as far as exploration of natural resources, so one cannot take any liberty into that. The laws are very, you can say, vague as well as in favor of the locals. And I think they have not been modified for ages.
Well, again, Dr. Hawk also may be able to provide a good answer. Let me provide a very general answer, not specific to Northeast India. But in land legislation, first of all, clarity is important, one. Two, for land rights to be secure, they have to be both socially legitimate and legally legitimate. Only looking at legal legitimacy without looking at social legitimacy is a big problem. And in fact, one could say if you look at colonial history in India and all over the world, it's been a big part of the problem because colonial powers took their laws and tried to make them legally legitimate in a completely different context where there was no social legitimacy. So paying attention to both is absolutely important. I say that because the issues around what's socially legitimate in the Northeast or in particular parts of the Northeast may be very different than they are in the rest of India, or it varies. The second thing is that just about general statement about land legislation. People sometimes try to place a false duality or a false binary on either it's on one side private, individual, freehold ownership, or it's government owned or whatever, it might be open access on the other side. That's a false duality. I have yet to see a situation anywhere. The truth is, it's always a spectrum. It's always a spectrum. Every land right system, every land right is always a mix between balancing the interests of the individuals who are occupying and using that land and the broader societal goals. Always. And it's not just the rights, it's the responsibilities. So achieving that right balance is going to be different in different settings, depending on the resources, depending on the social legitimacy. And that's why it's so important to know what is the realities on the ground and the culture and the social views before venturing into creating land laws. But it's always a balance. It's always a balance. And the government in every setting contains at least three important powers to exercise or assert the broader societal goals, if you will, to land. One of those is land taxation. Another is land use regulation. And a third is land acquisition for public use. And I have yet to see any jurisdiction around the world where the government doesn't have those three powers. Now, how they're exercised, in what cases, the devil is in the details. But the government always has those powers, and that's one key way to balance those. And it's appropriate for the government to have those powers. So again, it's a continuum. And so what are the specific answers for the Northeast? I leave that to my much more knowledgeable colleagues on left and right to answer.
Anyway, maybe afterwards I think I will address a bit on this. But if there are any other questions, yeah, Sanjay.
I'm not sure whether it is actually a question or not, but certainly an observation, and I want your thoughts on that. It's on the second point, which is regularization of informal occupations. And I think it relates to point number 3 and point number 5. It says, you mentioned about how it's important to regularize current occupation, and we all know about it, and it's extremely important. But what are the challenges? One is that we recently had a decade back, we had the Forest Rights Act, which recognized existing occupations on forest land. But we have about 70 to 75% of land where existing occupations are not recognized. They are not recognized because laws don't permit that. So there is a huge amount of disconnect between the existing land use and the classifications that we have. The classifications were made some 60 years back, which doesn't have any relevance to the current land use. So I think this is one area which I feel in the context of correcting land records and updating land records and regularizing on existing occupations, it's a mother of all interventions that we should be having now. And the second point, I'm not very sure whether to what extent modernizing of land records is actually addressing this challenge of these restrictions that we are having on regularizing on common on any kind of individual land.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. I agree with you. In my comments, I more emphasized here the legislative provisions that actually allow for this formalization. But as you rightly point out, there's a lot of there's still a gap in the law because there's still many classifications of land where it's not possible. And I think to the government, you find yourself, and this is not unique to India, it happens in a lot of countries, where people have been occupying land for a long time. Politically speaking, the government is not in a position, even if they wanted to evict them. But they also are not taking steps to regularize their occupation. So you have this very non-ideal status quo. And that's a big problem. So I think the government always has to look at, if not changing the law to allow for regularization, then what? And I think, as you rightly point out, the answer is likely to be, for most of these, is that these laws and regulations need to be changed to allow for regularization. So thanks for pointing out that issue. It's very important.
Yes, please. Somaji.
Thank you. I refer to your introduction where you spoke to land rights, land governance, and land policy. And then at the end of what you said, you spoke about women's land rights per se. Isn't it as important for land rights and land governance to be gender informed for actual distribution to occur in a gender equal way? It's not just land rights, therefore, I would submit, but land governance being gender sensitive and gender informed is as important, because otherwise we'll have the situation that you referred to, that customary practices will continue to deter women from actually claiming those rights.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I wish you'd talked with me before I'd written these remarks. I would have changed them. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not, laws need to change. I mean, just as one example, you see in many, if not most, Indian laws relating to land, it's not even gender-neutral language. It's very patriarchal language. Still in governance structures, both formal and informal, patriarchy plays a significant role. So, yeah, absolutely right.
My name is Rajesh Kapoor. I am a member of advisory board of Working Group on Women and Land Ownership, Gujarat, WGWL, and CEO of Cohesion Foundation Trust, working on these aspects. We work on livelihood securities, and so land and non-land-based livelihoods have a lot of interrelationships. But if we see in the recent past, there has been threats to some of the non-land-based livelihoods options, which people had been practicing for ages, which will create further pressure on land. So if you have some experiences how to address this so that we take proactive steps and so that the pressure on land gets reduced and those things don't happen.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for working on women's land rights issues, because sometimes there is this notion that women's land rights issues are issues that only women work on. So it's good to see men in the field. Specifically, what what livelihoods are you talking about, the non-land-based livelihoods for which there's pressure?
Basically, say Dalits, Muslims, say cow slaughters, those types of things are being, there is a threat to that. And so people now have to move from those, people had been practicing that of those occupations for ages, for centuries, and they know that only. But now shifting that to, say, land-based, either working as a laborer, agriculture laborer, or any other options which would put pressure on the land. That's the issue. And then they have started demanding lands. This is, if you want us to leave this livelihood option, then please give us land. So that's the current scenario.
I'm afraid I'm just not familiar enough to know what kind of steps. Again, my colleagues on the panel will probably be better suited to answer that question.
Any others? Maybe afterwards. Yeah, please.
I'm Sunil Simon. I'm an enthusiast. Like to know more about these issues. Just talking about the governance and the right part, and you're also highlighting one point. The data is a major the gap in data. So how do we see the new technologies like artificial intelligence or machine learning or those kind of things? Like, for example, Government of India has now established already a kind of center to work on artificial intelligence for the social good. And how these kind of new techniques and technologies can be brought into this kind of, to solve these kind of big issues?
Yeah, so I think that just to address this briefly, in part because of time and in part because I'm not that, my expertise doesn't run very deep here. And again, there are others in the audience or up here who could better answer this question. But the rapid pace of technology certainly does provide greater opportunities and potential for gathering the data in much lower cost ways. And we need, as a community, to leverage that, and as governments to leverage that. And it is being leveraged to some extent, but not to the extent it could be. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a specific session that'll address this.
Okay, if there is no more. Okay, so maybe take 5-10 minutes to. Friends, once again I welcome you to this important session. I should say the tone of the whole conference already has been set by the keynote speaker, Tim Henstead. And it is not really my duty to speak anything on this, but I should still take maybe 5-10 minutes to highlight some of the key issues that are attracting our attention, and also some of the points which need a little more elaboration. First of all, as you know, right from the very beginning, at least since independence, as we know, and all of you know, because at least working in the field of land reforms and land policies, that major focus was on how to improve the rural poor's access to land. Initially, of course, the land structure itself was unequal, exploitative. Relationship was very exploitative. There was a system of zamindari, or a lot of intermediaries were in the system, and that was not really conducive for either agricultural growth or for equity or for further rural transformation. So all these years, I think, right in the beginning, I should say in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s, a lot of laws were framed in order to change the character of the agrarian structure, and including abolition of intermediaries, imposition of ceiling on land holdings, then the tenancy laws, which team mentioned that it was either highly restrictive or in some cases the tenancy itself was banned. And then when probably government exhausted all these things, there's nothing, legislators were looking for some new things or the government was looking for some new things, then came like if no ceiling surplus land is available for redistribution, try to find some government land and redistribute or distribute it. So all these things we have seen all these years. And then again, just 1 or 2 minutes I will take, saying that in the context of ceiling surplus land, redistribution of ceiling surplus land, which was the most radical legislation, particularly from the point of view of improving poor people's access to land, almost all the states passed laws on ceiling, but so far hardly 5 million acres of land could be redistributed. So far, I'm telling you, we started in the 50s, in some cases, why I'm saying 50s, because West Bengal and Jammu and Kashmir passed the ceiling laws along with the abolition of intermediaries in the 50s. All other states did it in the early 60s. The first round of ceiling legislation. In the second round of ceiling legislation, again in the 1970s, early 70s. So all these years, a lot of state governments tried to pursue this agenda, but finally we found that it is only West Bengal to some extent where, some success was achieved. Otherwise, in most states, not really so much. Of the total 5 million acres of land, West Bengal alone redistributed 20% of the total land, ceiling surplus land. And 60% of the ceiling surplus beneficiaries in the country are in the state of West Bengal alone. And the remaining very large states, whether it's Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and all these big states were there, their share is very, very negligible, either in terms of area being distributed or the total number of beneficiaries. This is one thing that has happened. So, and as on today, if we talk of, again, pushing this agenda as some people are trying to do, my humble suggestion to them, this is my personal view, this is not a government's kind of thing. Don't take it that way, because otherwise I'll be in trouble. This is my personal view that as on today, the way the socio-political setting works, there is not much scope for either lowering the ceiling or redistributing the ceiling surplus land anymore. If there are any possibilities anywhere, probably there is the only thing is that about 1 lakh acre or so of land, ceiling surplus land, which is under litigation, probably that much can be expedited if there is a proper, kind of speedy process of disposing those land cases. Otherwise, I don't see much scope in this. Second thing is that government of the total government land that has been distributed, again we say that about 12 million acres of government land has been already distributed, and nearly 40% of it again is in the state of Andhra Pradesh alone. And again further, when we try to look at it, we find that in at least 60% of those cases, it was not really distributed in the proper sense. Like in some cases, it was given possession, but there was no kind of paper or patta or record or anything. In some cases, paper was given, but no possession was given. A lot of people, both rich and poor, they illegally encroached those lands, and it was not very easy for the government to, remove them from those places. So all this, still that kind of problem exists, and no government, whether Andhra government, a powerful Chandrababu Naidu, or anywhere anybody, is trying to address this issue of encroachment of public land by either rich or the poor people. Poor people normally, because they are in large numbers, having small half an acre or 10 cents, 5 cents kind of land being encroached by them for housing or for some other small activities. There are also vote banks, so they don't want to disturb them. So that is one aspect. Secondly, I think there are big, people, large landlords or mafias, I should say, for that matter, and they also are in the game, and they do all kinds of business with this. So I think that they also enjoy some kind of patronage of some governments, so they also are not much disturbed. So these are the practical problems in the field when you talk of, improving land governance and all that. The third important, Bhutan and Ramzan also we have seen, half of the Bhutan land, more than 5 million acres of land was supposed to have been donated by various people for redistribution to the poor people, either in a group or individually. But again, only half of it could be distributed. Again, the quality of land was very poor. In some cases, they say those land really did not exist. They are in the Ganges or some other rivers, and then nothing could be done about it. And here, so far on record, they say 30 to 40,000 acres of land probably are still available for redistribution, but that is not being distributed for the last several years. They say this is available, but this is not being distributed. Now, again, in this context, if you want to improve the rural poor's access to land, because anyway, as you know, 7 to 10% of the poor people in the villages are pure landless as on today. And if you include those who are having less than 5 hectare or so, then it will come above 40%. For that matter. So I think there is still a huge number of landless and semi-landless poor in the villages. And if you want to cover them, I don't think there are any way better than we thought, activizing the land lease market. Many people will, in the civil society groups, they will say, no, how can you talk of market and all that? I'm not saying that, it is an open kind of game, anybody can lease in or lease out. But at least for the poor people, there is no other option left unless we legalize and liberalize land leasing, at least for this purpose. Maybe within the ceiling limit, so that there is no concentration of land in a few hands because of leasing in and leasing out. If you have that in mind, and you allow leasing to take place by removing the illegal restrictions on land leasing that exist in various states, there will be people who will be willing to lease out and take up some non-farm activities. Not that we are pushing them to do that, but they themselves may be interested to do that. Currently, they are forced to stay sometime in agriculture because they think if they illegally lease out, they will lose their land rights because this is not legal. So they have that kind of apprehension. So how to remove that fear or apprehension is a big question. And secondly, there will be more and more people who will be, as I said, a huge number of landless and semi-landless poor people. They will be interested to lease in land, improve their livelihood, security and income for that matter by doing all that they can do, because that is the only thing probably agriculture which they know. They don't have education or skills to take up other many non-agricultural activities. So probably they can easily do that. And that does two things. First of all, that improves the rural poor access to land by way of leasing in. Secondly, currently, as Tim also told you, that all kinds of tenants that we have they are almost informal tenants. They don't have security of tenure. Also, there is no proper record of them. There is no lease agreement or anything of that sort. So what they do, they basically cultivate leasing in land from somebody on informal basis, but they cannot get institutional credit. They cannot get insurance benefits. If there is a disaster, floods or drought, even the government does not give them any compensation or relief because there is no record or there is no proof that they are the actual cultivators, they have lost their crops or anything. So, and then as on today, you will find about 25 million hectares of agricultural land is kept fallow in India. This is the average for the last 3-4 years. 25 million hectares. And if this land at least could be leased out to the poor people who can lease in for any number of years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, depending on what is convenient to them, and also convenience of the landowners for how long they can lease out. I think all these things will improve, land use productivity. The land will be productively utilized. The poor people will benefit, improve their, livelihood security and food security. And landowners also will, probably a lot of them will get out of agriculture and do something else. Either take up non-farm enterprises. Now there are a lot of new things our Prime Minister is saying in terms of developing, non-farm enterprises, startups and various other things, and also giving them training and skills. And if the people can get out of agriculture, some of those people who are interested to do that, who have the ability to take up non-farm enterprises, they should be, facilitated to do that. Also in terms of access to credit and other facilities, so that they can also become, viable and sustainable. So, broad framework of this policy, when we tried to do it in Niti Aayog, we have, formulated a model land leasing act, which said that now this is time, we should try to remove all these restrictions and legalize land leasing, and with the broad objectives of improving the poor people's access to land, and also improved utilization of land. As I said, efficiency also improves. And occupational mobility takes place. That paves the way for rural transformation, because currently, according to Census of India, 55% of the total workforce in this country is engaged in agriculture. And engaged means they are underemployed, I should say. They are not fully employed because there is no full-time work. And also, the way land productivity and labor productivity is huge, I think there are some issues. So I think it is time that from the point of view of agricultural growth, equity, and also rapid rural transformation, we need to reform the existing land leasing laws. And luckily, or I think as a matter of happiness, I should say, at least for me personally, we have been able to persuade at least 4 or 5 states to come to accept our views and adopt the Model Land Leasing Act. Uttar Pradesh has amended their law partially. There are some issues there also they need to address. Uttarakhand has done it. Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, they have passed a new law on the line of our Model Land Leasing law that needs, of course, the President's assent for some time. For bureaucratic reasons, delays and all that has to be circulated to different departments, get their views. If some department does not give a positive view, again, it is referred back to the state government, then again, they have to reply, it comes, all kinds of problems. So that took time, but hopefully in the next few days, this also will be cleared. Punjab government is likely to do it in the next budget session, they said, hopefully. So some of the states are working on this. So I think, although I was not very hopeful, things are so complex and complicated, particularly the political leadership, most of the time is so apprehensive of any change, at least in the field of land reform. So I think there are issues, but still I think slowly we are moving. Then the second area on which team also mentioned, and we are working in Niti Aayog, is, the issue of conclusive land titling. For that, before that already we have a big program of computerization of land record, right, starting from 1986, 87. And we had a very big kind of national rural land modernization program. Recently, now we have the whole program is now Digital India land, kind of records program. Now, a lot of progress has taken place. My friends from NCR, they did some work in some of the states, at least 4 states or 5 states. 3. And there are some gaps in whatever the government claims, or at least says that it has been done or not done. But those issues will be simultaneously addressed as we feel that this is time when we should start the process of land titling. There are risks involved, as Tim also mentioned, unless the land record is proper, updated, and both textual and spatial data are matched. And then again, there is active participation of the local people, those who will benefit from this or lose from this. So unless they are also involved at the community level, so I think this should not be done. But there is a process involved, and this is possible to do it in a participatory manner. The first stage, at least updation and digitization of land record. And then after that, I think we begin at least in states where things are in advanced stage. And simultaneously, there will be challenges, there will be problems, and then we simultaneously address those challenges and at least do something concrete in at least in some respect in some places. And then see if there are problems, probably that will be stopped elsewhere. Or again, we'll review the whole things. But there is no question that we need to update and digitize land records, both textual and spatial kind of data. Third thing is management of common lands and management of forest lands. As regards forest land, as you know, already we had a very good law, I should say, 2006 FRA, Forest Rights Act, provides that kind of rights to forest dwellers, not just the tribals, but any other forest dwellers. But then this is, in most cases, we find that this has not been properly implemented. So now this is one of the things which we think we need to do it, both from the point of view of inclusive growth, giving the land access to the poor people, at least for proper utilization, maybe either individual frame or in a community frame. But at least those things need to be done. Village commons, I think the data itself, there are a lot of people who will tell about it, that we say that there are a lot of common lands available, say, in the 50s and 60s, whether it is grazing land for the cattle or some other ponds, tanks, and lakes and things like that. But now those things, in most cases, are not usable or have been eroded drastically. So whether we can again revive those things, but for that the database itself is very poor. We don't have much data. Not much research also has happened, like in respect of all these commerce. There are some National Sample Survey, they did something NSSO, but again, I think there are issues with that. So I think, first of all, I think we need to improve the database for both commons and forest land, because you will find here in the case of forest land, in Odisha, area under shifting cultivation is considered, a government land, isn't it? So I think they're fine-tuning those revenue land and forest lands. There are a lot of controversies and conflicts. So all those things have to be, seriously taken at the state level. The concerned department, they should sit together with the chief minister or the chief secretary and try to sort out this. Somehow, this also does not happen in many cases. Then we have an issue which is probably more important in the present context. All of us are working about mostly either agricultural land, forest land, and common lands. But today, land is in growing demand, not just for agriculture or forestry or management of common lands, but also for urbanization, for industrialization, for infrastructure development. And from the point of view of economic growth, I think, or development, you need anyway land for infrastructure. You can't say you don't need industries, you don't need services, you don't need infrastructure. You need those things. But the biggest challenge for our land governance system is to see how we provide a framework, legal, institutional, administrative framework for most efficient, inclusive, and sustainable use of land, available land. Land is scarce anyway. What we need to do in a manner which takes care of interest of development, which takes care of interest of the livelihood of the people in agriculture or outside. And so how do we do it? I think many times we find the government fails to do it or balance this kind of conflicting interests, partly because we don't involve the people, we don't consult them, and we don't evolve policies in consultation with the people who are the affected parties or who are likely to be affected. So there are some such issues. But anyway, I think we need to address some of those things clearly. Somebody said about Northeast, I think Northeast, Meghalaya is one, but then there are several other states. Meghalaya itself, I think the land tenure system varies from place to place. Jayantia Hills, Khasi Hills, or Garo Hills, they don't have the same system in all the three places. The state laws are there, but more than the state laws, the local customary laws prevail there. Many times the state government, even though they have passed a law, they find it difficult to implement them in those 2-3 different settings, even within Meghalaya. Earlier, Meghalaya was a part of Assam, so Assam law also continue to be relevant even today in some cases, even after the Meghalaya has passed a law. But the point is, normally our approach is that customary land laws have to be taken cognizance of. First, you analyze them. You need not straightway codify them because there are issues unless you first analyze and understand the kind of situations, dynamics, and whatever way it functions. You cannot simply just codify and make a new law or extending your other laws to those areas. There are practical problems of social equilibrium getting disturbed, new political problems arising or conflicts coming from those areas. So I think it is not very easy. But then otherwise also we find in the customary area, where the customary land laws are there, for that matter in most of the northeastern states, there is a lot of informality. Many cases, the local chiefs where that exists, in some cases that has been abolished, but in cases where that has not been abolished, they feel there is still the kings, and they try to, not only, make law or rules, but they decide what needs to be done in terms of either allocation of land or giving land to, outsiders even for agriculture or even for industry or infrastructure. In many cases, they think it is their own property, personal property, and they take some decisions, and then the community at large there, they get disturbed. They think they have been traditionally cultivating this piece of land or using that piece of land in a very productive way or harmonious way, but that is getting disturbed without their knowledge, and that is bringing new kinds of conflicts in some of those areas. So all these things anyway need to be addressed for better and harmonious kind of use of all these resources that we have. So a lot of challenges are there, I'll say. Land rights of women, there are so many experts, Govind and Anisa and so many people here, Parthasarathi. I will only say that this is also recognized in the policy circle now, at least you must have seen at least the Women and Child the department, their kind of policy on women that mentions about also the land rights or the how women should be involved or not involved in that. Maybe it's still not perfect. Anybody will have questions whenever we do something, but that can be further improved upon. But at least that addresses the issue that we need to take care of this gender dimension of the problem, and also FAO and other sources have documented kind of research findings which say that if you give women equal access to land and other resources, both average income of the country and will improve significantly. But in some cases, they say 20% or 30%, and rural poverty, for that matter, will drastically drop. So I think that itself should compel the government's concerned, whether a state government or central government, to do something about it. But unfortunately, as Tim also mentioned, the women's secure land rights, I think, is very, very minimal in the sense, even though the agriculture census data says 10 to 12% women have access to ownership right, there is not really ownership, that some kind of operational holding their control. Although in practice, as you know, maybe 43 or 45% of women are actively engaged in agriculture. So they are engaged in agriculture, but they don't have land right. They can't get institutional credit. Again, it's like informal tenants. They are also that kind of marginal category of people in this country. So unless you address this seriously, I think agricultural productivity growth suffers. The poor women remains marginalized, and they are not, able to come at par with others, their male counterparts, and to, be on the move in a democratic society like ours. So there are issues, and I think we need to address some of those issues. At least in Niti Aayog, from our perspective, I'm thinking that some of these issues are quite important, and whenever there is any good suggestion, good points that you have, you can bring it to me and to us, and then probably we'll try to address those issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And I think we'll be closing the session, and I request my friend Jayesh Bhatia to offer the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. There's some familiar faces from last year and some new faces. So welcome to all of you on this second edition of the India Land Development Conference, or as we said during the closing ceremony of last year's, as a India Land Development Coalition. We're delighted at NRMC and on behalf of the partners of the organizing committee that we start this on such a high note with, what Tim mentioned, not only a personal journey, but in terms of, a way forward for us as individuals and institutions to carry it forward. I think we at NRMC, ably led by, Pranab, have really been grappling with this issue, and what Tim did mention on that the impact that we could potentially do within one generation with secure land, and there's another sector in terms of education that he also alluded to. So about 3 years back, when we were, or 4 years back, when as a team at NRMC, we were really looking at reviewing what we've done since 2003 when NRMC was founded. There were 3 aspects that we realized that we need to kind of build on and look at sectors that we need to kind of focus on. So when we started in 2003, there were 3 key words that we thought we would really work on. One was in terms of whatever we do, whatever we facilitate, whatever we contribute to, should bring that impact. And for that impact, the second word really was evidence, because, having worked in the sector, all of us, we were really concerned that most back in 2000, 2002, when we were thinking about setting up NRMC, that there wasn't enough evidence to various policies, institutions, and impacts that we were talking about. Most of it was anecdotal. And what is it that we as a team could bring in on ensuring that there is evidence to whatever people in the sector and we are contributing to? And third word and third key attribute that we're really looking at was how do we make these changes at scale? And, over the last 15 years that NRMC has been in existence formally, we've really looked at and increasingly work on these, bring these 3 key aspects as part of our work. So when we were reviewing what, as a team, what we've done, what we've achieved, and what we have not achieved, I think there were three key words really came to us. One was in terms of partnership. Third was in terms of innovations and what we can do. And third was in terms of technology, is what we can really do to, again, keep focusing on impact, evidence, and scale as we deepen our engagement with the different sectors that we've been operating in. And two sectors that really we studied and looked at very, very closely. One was education, and second was land. And we realized that if we do look at land as a sector, because a lot of people, a lot of groups have been working in the education sector, and it's been kind of mainstream more so by government and various other partners. Land remains one area where, again, there are a lot of partners, a lot of individuals, a lot of institutions that have been working. Can we try and attempt to bring together various actors, various interests onto a common platform and see where do we lead to? And I'm delighted with this small, short journey that we've had, and thanks to all of you, where we are, where we do need to look at all these 6 key words on impact, evidence, scale, innovation, and see how best we are able to take all of this along with the partnership that we've been able to forge, contributions that have come from all of you. I'm really thankful to you, Tim, and of course the leadership of Dr. Huck, that this event has started on a very, very strong note, intellectual, emotional, and with all the evidence that we can bring together. And as we look forward over the next 2.5 days, all partners coming together, all individuals coming together, we should be really looking at a very, very impressive and impactful 2.5 days. Thank you so much for all of you to being here.